And welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. You know, as COVID rumbles on, there's an opportunity for Canadian scientists and entrepreneurs to help treat against the worst effects of this virus. Dr. Robert Foster joins us from Edmonton. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Hepion Pharmaceuticals and also is a former founder of Isotechnica Pharma, Inc. He is also currently Professor, Faculty of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of Alberta. Dr. Foster, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Could you tell us how you first got involved in COVID treatment?
Well, it sort of came about a little bit by accident because of the pandemic. We were working on a class of drugs that we knew had, from previous experience, we knew that this class of drugs had antiviral properties, and we had tested our drug against hepatitis B and hepatitis C, as well as D and HIV. And back in 2015, we also noticed that the drug had some activity against the original coronavirus, the one that caused the SARS. And so based on that, when we heard about this pandemic that really started picking up steam earlier this year, we thought it just made natural sense that this compound of ours called CRV431 could potentially have some good activity against the new coronavirus, the coronavirus 2.
And what was the next step? Did you just start experimenting using the data that was available on COVID-19?
We did, actually. So what we did, the first thing we thought we'd do is we'd explore two properties of the drug. One was the antiviral property that we wanted to take a look at. So to that extent, we shipped off our compound, our CRV431. I'll just call it CRV. We shipped off CRV to a number of independent laboratories in Germany, the US, here in Canada, and wanted to check out the antiviral properties. The second thing we did is we wanted to look at the anti-inflammatory and anti-lung injury properties of our drug, because we had done previous experiments, again with CRV, that showed that we have an ability to protect certain organs. For example, the liver and the lungs. And so specifically in COVID-19, it makes a lot of sense to see if we can protect the lungs from further injury or from becoming injured in the first place. And that's something that we also want to try and test.
And so the results so far are positive then?
They are. As a matter of fact, we got the results back from the laboratory testing in Massachusetts, looking at lung injury, and the results were quite profound. We saw significant reduction in the inflammation and also the scarring of the lungs. This is obviously not in a human, but in an animal study that we did. We also saw things that are called cytokines being reduced, and these cytokines are responsible for some of the inflammation and damage that also occurs in the lungs. So we got those results back. And then from a number of laboratories, we also looked at the antiviral properties, and those came back positive too, which it tells me we probably have a drug potentially that has a 1-2 hit. It can hit the virus and also hit the lung injury that happens downstream of having the viral infection.
And what's the next stage for this drug development then, Doctor?
Well, we've got a couple of activities ongoing in the company right now. So one of those activities is just looking at how much it'll cost us to move the drug to the clinic in a larger clinical trial in patients that have COVID. So we're looking at where can we get some of the funding, or should we fund it ourselves? But I think ideally we'd like to get external funding. So we're exploring some of those external sources. And then in parallel with that, we're also looking at submitting an investigational new drug application. We just call it an IND application. And that's so that we can get authorization by the FDA to move forward and do what's called a phase 2 clinical trial. And with any positive outcome on a phase 2 clinical trial, then we could move straight to a phase 3 and move this program along fairly quickly.
We'll come right back. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me today is Dr. Robert Foster of the University of Alberta. But as importantly, he is an entrepreneur, a scientist who's looking at various compounds, including one that can assist us in the fight against COVID-19. Dr. Foster, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We were talking about the CRV, this potential treatment for COVID-19, but really this is just one example of research and development that you have done that involves obviously Canada. You're a Canadian. Tell us about some of your other successes.
Well, back in June of 1993, I started a company. As these companies often go, they're very, very small companies. That company was called Isotechnica. And the whole idea behind Isotechnica was to try to advance it. Well, first of all, discover a drug and advance it in the clinic for solid organ transplantation. So, for example, in kidney transplantations. But at the same time, we also took the molecule that I discovered in the mid-1990s, which is called voclosporin. We took that molecule and we also tested it in what we would call autoimmune disease treatment. So, for example, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, lupus, or lupus nephritis. And to that extent, a number of years ago, I did a licensing agreement with a company in Victoria, BC called Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. And I wound up acquiring Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. And we started actually pushing really hard on the lupus nephritis indication, much harder than the renal transplant indication. So in fact, that became the leading indication for the company. We also changed the company name from Isotechnica to Aurinia Pharmaceuticals. And the drug now is probably just a few months away from what I think will be an approval with the US FDA. So that's the first drug I developed. This is the second drug that we're working on right now. And I also developed a diagnostic kit a number of years ago that I've since sold, and that's to diagnose a bacteria called Helicobacter pylori, and that's a bacteria that causes ulcers. And so it's a breath test, basically, very much almost like a roadside alcohol breath test. You blow into a tube and it tells you if you're positive for this bug that causes ulcers.
So based on all of that experience, and the reason I wanted you to tell that story is it's a broader story about pharmaceutical development in Canada. Tell us what you see as the state of R&D in pharmaceuticals in Canada right now.
Well, I think Canada is blessed by having a lot of really, really good and dedicated scientists and entrepreneurs. But the challenge I can tell you that I've faced pretty much since day one is always a problem of funding. And I think if you go to any person working in this field in Canada, they will tell you that funding has always been the issue. And for me right now, with Hepion Pharmaceuticals, our head office is based in Edison, New Jersey. The R&D facility is based in Edmonton. The challenge is always there for the financing, but the financing is, at least in my opinion, the financing is much more, I guess I would say somewhat easier to obtain if you have a U.S. presence. And so with the U.S. presence that we have in Hepion, there seems to be a lot more money than there ever was in my previous experience with Isotechnica. And even with Isotechnica, I would say virtually all the money and the financing we brought in over the years came from outside of Canada. So in that case, it was predominantly coming from the US and also from Switzerland and from South Korea.
So that, we've got a minute before the break, but basically that tells a story of a difficulty for finding sort of Canadian financing for these ventures.
It's a challenge. It's a big challenge. I think Quebec has pretty good sources of financing. Ontario maybe had some, maybe to a lesser extent. Alberta, I would say, from a biotech financing standpoint, is honestly it's a wasteland, and I think it's probably because of oil and gas and natural resources have been so lucrative for the province that the biotech field has just sort of languished off to the side.
Let's return to this topic after the break. We're speaking with Dr. Robert Foster, a pharmaceutical entrepreneur and scientist. We'll be back right after the break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me is Dr. Robert Foster of the University of Alberta, a pharmaceutical scientist, entrepreneur. Dr. Foster, thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
We were talking before the break about the state of R&D in the pharma sector in Canada. You made the point that it's tough to find the financing. What sorts of things can be done and should be done to improve upon this or ameliorate these issues?
Well, that's a really good question. It's one that I've been thinking about for a long, long time. I can perhaps start with one that is probably somewhat near and dear to my heart, because, and I think it was about the year 2012, possibly 2013. We had to do some ridiculous, I would call them ridiculous financings to keep our company alive. And one of the things that we had to do many years ago in Isotechnica before it became Arenia was we sold our tax losses. Mm-hmm. And here in Alberta, we picked up just pennies on a dollar for our tax losses. With Hepion now, of course, we're an R&D company, so we're always having these tax losses. But to contrast that to Alberta, we were able to pick up about 95 to 98 cents on the dollar with our tax losses in New Jersey. So if I look back,
is that because New Jersey is they understand the business better, or they've got a different legal system that assists in doing that? How does that work?
I think they understand the business a lot better. So if you go to New Jersey, whether you're driving on a car or whatnot, you'll pass, for example, Johnson & Johnson and Merck, Bristol Myers Squibb, and all kinds of biotech companies are really, really thick. There's a lot of infrastructure when it comes to biotech and pharmaceuticals in New Jersey. Whereas, again, to contrast that in Alberta, we picked up, I think it was like 4 or 5 cents on the dollar. And so we left so much money on the table. And that actually made the difference almost between success and failure. So I had to do a lot of, I would call it fancy footwork to keep Isotechnica alive. And that's why eventually I acquired Arenia, and it's done quite well. So, if I look at Arenia today on the Toronto Stock Exchange, it's worth about $2.5 billion. But that took a lot of work to get it there. And the current management team at Arenia, who's focused on lupus nephritis, has done a spectacular job. But there again, the senior management of Arenia looks to be they're sort of moving down into the States. So it's unfortunate to see always this migration of these types of companies into the U.S., but it's almost out of necessity because there is the infrastructure, there is the population base, there's a pharmaceutical base, the biotech base. It's all there. And in Alberta, again, from my experience, it was really, really tough.
That's very interesting because obviously we hear this story over and over again about the allure of the United States and the tech area as well. Obviously, one of the things that people have told us over time is that because we have a single payor system in Canada, we've got certain advantages, but you weren't able to see those advantages for your businesses necessarily. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. And again, it's the R&D stage, the research and development. So at that point, of course, you're just burning cash, and it takes a lot of money to keep a biotech company alive. It's very easy to burn through $1 million a month with a small biotech company because clinical trials are so expensive. I mean, people have often talked about numbers that are astronomical in the range of $2.5 billion to just bring one single molecule to the market as a drug. Biotechs can probably do it for a lot less money than that, but still, the money that you're laying out each month is horrendous. And as a CEO of a biotech company, you realize that your job, even though you really love science and you want to dig into the science, your job quickly becomes just a full-time, fundraising, and it's tough. Much easier, I would say, in the U.S., but really tough in Canada.
Dr. Robert Foster is joining us today. We're talking about pharma in general, obviously his breakthrough with respect to treatment for COVID-19. Stay with us as we continue on this topic after the break. And we're back at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement. With me today is Dr. Robert Foster of the University of Alberta, who's also a pharma entrepreneur and scientist. Thanks again for joining us, Dr. Foster.
Thank you.
I think one of the things that we should mention to our audience is that what you're working on is a treatment for COVID. So that's how, if somebody contracts the disease, how we can make sure they get healthier, quicker, and better. There's also the ongoing, people are paying rapt attention to the development of a vaccine. Now, I know you're not a vaccine developer. I know you're not holding yourself out to be a vaccine developer, but I'd love to just have your opinion about that from your point of view as a person who's creating treatments, this holy grail, perhaps, of this vaccine development. Any thoughts on the matter?
Well, I was just actually looking at some of the numbers recently. It looks like worldwide there's more than 150 companies that are working on vaccines. So it seems there's a lot of action out there. But there's a few front runners, I would say, just a small handful of 4 or 5 companies that are working on vaccines that are later stage and quite promising. These vaccines will probably take more time to develop. I know that, south of the border, they're talking about maybe having a vaccine ready by election time. I would bet money that won't be the case because the vaccines, to be able to get to the general public, first of all, have to be safe, well tolerated, and effective, of course. But even if they meet all of those, hurdles, you still have to be able to develop this and manufacture it in a situation where you can put out billions of doses. That's going to be a really tough hurdle to get over. I think, especially if we're looking at trying to vaccinate a large proportion of the population globally, it's a tough task.
So do you think that there's any possibility in the next few months of having something workable? Or, I know we're not putting all of our eggs in that basket, but I'm going to say this, you don't have to say this. We should also put a lot of effort into treatment because, if you contract COVID-19, if we can mitigate the effects of that so that the scarring of the lungs or other bad things that happen as a result of COVID are eliminated, that's got to be a good news story too.
Well, it sounds like we're both singing from the same songbook here, because one of the things I was thinking about, and our team has been thinking about for some time since COVID came about, is even if there is a vaccine, I think there's a large proportion of people that won't take it. And if somebody's infected, a vaccine's basically useless because you have to get ahead of that infection for a prophylactic vaccine to work. In other words, there is a crying need and will be a crying need for quite some time for a treatment of people that have the virus. And so in our case, we're looking at treating people so that, first of all, the virus replication of the virus goes down. So we're treating the virus. But the other thing, we're hearing a lot of reports about a lot of organs that get damaged by COVID. And obviously, the one that people talk probably about the most is the damage to the lungs, but also damage to the heart, damage to the kidneys. There's thrombosis or clotting problems, maybe even central nervous system problems. So there's a whole host of problems that could be downstream effects of the virus that a treatment like CRV 431, we hope will address some of these problems. So, for example, the lung injury. Also, we think we might have an effect on other organ injury, for example, kidney and heart.
Dr. Robert Foster has joined us today. I want to thank you, Dr. Foster, for being part of this program and wish you every success in the development of your CRV treatment for COVID-19. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. I want to commend people like Dr. Foster who are working, on the front lines to try to develop treatments for COVID-19 as well as many other diseases. They are true entrepreneurs and certainly they are finding a way to get it done. In Canada, maybe a little bit of financing out of the United States, but certainly the benefits will come to Canadians as well as others. So let's wish Dr. Foster and his team the best of success in getting their product to market, and certainly others in the same field who are doing some amazing work. Stay with us for more episodes of Boom and Bust.